Welcome to Akhenaten, A Different View. So, Akhenaten, on one side, painted as a free thinker and a man of spiritual concerns, possibly the first monotheist, and then the other side, there are those who think that he was a misshapen man, a tyrannical despot. So what did he do? Well, according to mainstream history and mainstream Egyptology, he scrapped Egypt's pantheon of gods to worship his new god, the Aten, the sun. He created a new form of art that really showed that he was deformed or suffering from some terrible illness. This is the understanding by a lot of people. He abandoned Thebes and he built a new capital city. He certainly did that. He was obsessed with poetry and nature and so ignored the empire to the point where it almost collapsed. And of course he shut down the temples and he persecuted the priests and he forced everyone to worship his new god, the Aten. Well, this is the picture that's painted of Akhenaten, and I believe that we need to look at the evidence and see whether or not this is really the case. So let's begin at the beginning. What did he do? Well, he scrapped the pantheon of gods that had reigned over Egypt and looked after Egypt for the last couple of thousand years or so. He scrapped them all for his own non-anthropomorphic god, the Aten, the sun. The national god at the time was Amun, and Amun had held an important position for many years. He was quite big in the Middle Kingdom, and it was really the collapse of Egypt into the Second Intermediate Period and the occupation of the Hyksos that really saw Amun relegated back to a regional position centered around Thebes, where he was the cult god of that area. And as the Theban kings kind of stormed into the 18th dynasty with the expulsion of the Hyksos, so Amun's power rose. Amun was credited by the kings and by everybody really as being behind the success of the Theban kings in getting rid of the vile Amu, and so quickly Amun rose to become the national god, the savior of Egypt. And the Amun priesthood were very clever, because what they did was established Amun as an aspect of Ra. Ra existed in every single temple throughout the country, throughout the land. And by associating Amun with Ra, they kind of gave Amun this national credibility. And Amun became the national god. And really, everything was controlled through Amun. Amun controlled the country, not just the country, but also Amun controlled the king. So what happened with Akhenaten? Well, supposedly Akhenaten said enough of Amun, but before we go there, we have to actually understand that it wasn't Akhenaten who began pulling away. We have to go back a little bit further. Before his father, Amenhotep III, or even his grandfather, Thutmose IV, we have to go back, right back to the time of Amenhotep II. Now, prior to this, during the New Kingdom, the majority of administration and government was run from the Theban area. And when we got to this point in the New Kingdom, the influences of the north started to increase, and there were royal residences and re-established in and around the Memphis area, and often they would go hunting across the Giza Plateau. So that was where I headed first, off to Giza, just to the south of modern-day Cairo, because it was here that Amenhotep II built a temple to the Sphinx as Horemheb. He was named ruler of Heliopolis rather than Thebes, and this was quite a change. His successor, Thutmose IV, we all know the story of Thutmose IV, who fell asleep in the shade of the Sphinx, who was buried up to his neck, and the Sphinx said, "If you uncover me, then I'll make you king." And he did, and he was king. And Thutmose IV owed his throne to the Sphinx and to the combination deity Horemheb Khepri Ra Atum. the priest of Heliopolis called Thutmose, son of Atum, and protector of Horakti, who purifies Heliopolis and satisfies Ra. Thutmose IV married the daughter of the king of Mitanni, and I believe that this brought a degree of free thinking and new thinking to the court. And we see with Thutmose IV an increasing identification with solar deities. If we look at his chariot, the chariot that was discovered in his tomb, we see this is the king's battle chariot, not a single mention of Amun at all. So Thutmose IV began increasingly identifying himself with the solar deities, to a point where there was a scarab issued that features the Aten as a god of war. Amenhotep III saw a widening of the gap, and although he never denied Amun, he increasingly associated himself with Heliopolitan thought. His famous scribe, Amenhotep, son of Harpu, called the king heir of Atum and the firstborn son of Horakti. The royal court had grown into a meeting point for diplomats and ambassadors and artisans from all over the known world, and it was a time of peace and possibly a time for children. Nothing is really known of young Akhenaten or Amenhotep's childhood. The first reference to him is from a wine jar from Malkata, labelled the estate of the king's true son, Amenhotep. And life must have been full of luxury at the court of Amenhotep III, to the point that it's been compared to perhaps that of the French Sun King, Louis XIV. So Amenhotep wasn't the only son. There was an older son named Thutmose, and Amenhotep IV, the future Akhenaten, as second in line to the throne, would have no doubt studied under the priests of Ra in Heliopolis. The disappearance of his older brother Thutmose from the scene would have forced Akhenaten to be rushed through to the point of kinghood. And here we see, this is from the lintel of the tomb of Keroef. Keroef was the steward of Akhenaten's mother, Ti. And we see the young Amenhotep with not his kingly titles, but with his Neferkheperure Wainre name. We see him here to the left-hand side. He's there with his mother behind him. And they're offering oils to Ra-Horakti, who is ably supported by Mart. And on the other side, we can see again the young Amenhotep with his mother Ti behind him, and he's offering something to Atum, who is supported by Hathor. Amenhotep III increasingly describes himself as the Aten, as the dazzling Aten for all lands. He commissions a royal barge that's called the Aten Gleams, and the name even filters down to a company of his soldiers. And what we see a massive rise in the significance of Ra-Horakti, and here we see Amenhotep III next to a similar sized statue of Ra-Horakti. Ra-Horakti rejoicing on the horizon in his name as Shu, who is in the Aten. The Aten name becomes synonymous with Ra-Horakti of Heliopolis, not as a new god, and this must be emphasized, but as a means of establishing a difference between Amun-Ra and Ra-Horakti. The king, as the son of Ra, assumes the power of the throne as the aging Ra hands down his power. Horus of the two horizons becomes the god of the rising and the setting sun, and the patron of the king. The sun was now not the physical manifestation of Amun, but was rather the vehicle for the supreme deity, the visible power of light, sunlight. And what we see here is, on the left, we see the determinative for sunlight, and on the right-hand side, we can see a simplified version of the Aten, but you can see the commonality there is between the two. But let's pause the story of religion for a while and look at the second item on the list, and that was that he revolutionized Egyptian art to reflect his own shortcomings. The bizarre Amarna art, almost a misnomer, seeing as the majority of this art actually happened while he was still in the Theban area rather than once he'd moved downriver. We see the long elongated faces, the thin necks, the elongated skulls, sloping foreheads, large thighs, and extended stomachs. And these depictions have led to claims that the king suffered from Froelich syndrome or Marfan's, or even that he was in fact female. With the young Amenhotep's tutelage under the priest of Ra at Heliopolis and his understanding of perhaps the older religions, there's been suggested that perhaps there's a suggestion of the shapes and forms that are used in Amarna art are related to these archaic figurines which were discovered by Petrie. But time for me to move from Giza and head south to Luxor. What we see in Luxor is that art was already moving in a different direction, and these are a couple of depictions from the Theban tombs of the nobles. These were both nobles under Amenhotep III, and on the left we see the musicians from the tomb of Nacht, and on the right we see the mourners from the tomb of Ramos. And what we're seeing here is perhaps the younger artists, perhaps the mainstream artists were involved on building works for Amenhotep III, or busy engaged in the decorations of Malkata. So what we see are the apprentices, perhaps the sons of the master craftsmen, are busy doing the minor characters within these tombs. And what we see for the first time is a breakaway from the established conservatism of Egyptian art, and we see an attempt at just capturing a snapshot of life, and there's a fluidity and a sense of motion that these artists have attempted to capture, and I believe this had a strong influence on the style of Amarna art. Staying in the tomb of Ramos, one of the best examples of the difference between the classical art and the classical depiction and the Amarna style is in the same tomb of Ramos. When you walk into the tomb, you're walking through the main doorway into this large room filled with columns, and through the columns, there's at the far side of the columns, there's a doorway that leads down to the main tomb area, and either side of that doorway we see these incredible two depictions. On the left-hand side, we see Amenhotep IV, again with his mother this time as Mart, and next door, literally next door, I mean, there's a doorway in between the two. We see one of the first appearances of Akhenaten and Nefertiti at the window of appearances, and just fantastic to be able to see the two juxtaposed like this. But I wanted more, so I headed to Karnak in search of Akhenaten, and of course I found him, because here in the open air museum, where not many people go to, and it's not particularly well signposted or anything, I found this massive section of wall, and this shows Akhenaten, or Amenhotep IV, as pharaoh in the traditional striking pose. We can see his arm out clutching the hair of various captives, and no doubt his other arm was raised and holding, ready to strike with a club or a mace or something like that. And just to give you some idea of scale of this wall, that signpost is about 6 foot tall. This section of wall was part of an addition that Amenhotep IV made to his father's third pylon, but which was later dismantled. But not enough for me. I wanted to see where these came from. These huge statues that were discovered largely intact, actually buried in the ground. I was looking for the Jempa Aten. I had with me a copy of a photo from the Akhenaten Temple Project report from the summer of '77, and this was my guide, and we can see here. This is the eastern end of Karnak. This is the Nectar Nebo Gate, and this is actually outside the complex. And we can see on the ground here, these are the concrete or the stone piers that these vast statues would have stood on. There's an interesting theory about these vast statues and those elongated faces. And one of the ideas, one of the suggestions that has come about is that these statues, which were incredibly tall, were always designed to be looked at from the ground. We tend to look at these things square on, and what we should be doing is standing underneath them and looking up at them. And when we do that, we find that actually the perspective of the faces changes completely, and maybe we've just been looking at them in the wrong way. Perhaps we look at so many things in the wrong way. These early buildings of Akhenaten are where we find a great deal of the Amarna art portrayed on the building blocks, the particular building blocks that he used, called talatat. Talatat is an Arabic word implying 3 hands, which was about the size of these blocks. And what these blocks enabled Akhenaten to do was build incredibly quickly, because it was easier to cut them, it was easier to manhandle them, and easier to build. And another interesting and highly likely theory is that the temple structures of Akhenaten were all open air. So prior to that, the classic Egyptian temple was a dark and gloomy place, and the further you got into the temple, into the Holy of Holies, it was an incredibly dark place. Because Akhenaten's temples were all open air, they didn't have roofs, and because they didn't have roofs, they didn't need to have these huge load-bearing walls. So it allowed them to build in this much smaller style. We were very lucky that the particular kings who came after Akhenaten, who wanted to obliterate him from memory, they used many of these smaller bricks as filler material for building their own pylons at Karnak, and this has fortunately preserved them and kept them. And there's a very fine example of these talatat walls in the Luxor Museum. So when it comes to the Amarna style of art, and certainly the early stuff, I believe that those style of painting that we saw in the Theban tombs had a lot to do with this quick fluidity, and it occurred to me that perhaps Akhenaten's epithet, living in Mart, also had a very real sense of living in the now, and that all of these depictions are very much snapshots rather than posed depictions. And as far as his appearance is concerned, I think we only have to look at later material. And here's a picture of the royal couple for the museum in Berlin, and we can see that this deformity, it's not there at all. And in fact, if we go to this, we can only really marvel at actually just the sheer beauty of that, and there really is nothing abnormal about that. So Amarna art, what else did he do? He abandoned Thebes and he built a new capital city. He did indeed, guilty as charged. He upped sticks from the Theban area and where his father's huge new palace was being built, and moved everything to Tel El Amarna. So what was I to do but follow suit? And indeed I did. I arrived at Tel El Amarna and crossed the river and off to the local police station, which also serves as a tourist office. And there I was greeted with much enthusiasm by the local commissioner of police, as I think I was the first person who'd been there for 2 or 3 months or something, and he proudly showed me his flushing toilet with toilet paper, which for any of you who've been in Egypt, you'll understand that what an honour and a luxury that was. So off we went into the desert, and here we are, Amarna. The city of Amarna is about 8 kilometres long and 5 kilometres wide, enclosed by cliffs to the east and down to the river at the west. And at first glance, there's really nothing to be seen. of Amarna, but it's beneath the sand that we see the footprint of the city, and a lot of credit has to go to Professor Barry Kemp and the Amarna project for uncovering this stuff and mapping out the footprints of the existing buildings. Here's the mansion of the Arten. The city itself is structured along a north-south axis. This is the royal road that kind of runs from the north all the way down in a kind of gentle curve, kind of paralleling the river a little bit. Most of the royal buildings and the offices lie in the north, while the south seems to be mainly residential. The extent of Akhenaten is defined by a series of stelae. There are 3 on the west side of the river and 13 on the east side of the river. It's often forgotten with Akhenaten, as the new city was called, was that actually there was a great deal of fertile land on the west side that was used for agricultural purposes and farming, for producing produce and whatever. I think we all tend to forget that and tend to just look at the desert plain on the east side of the river. Anyway, the first proclamation was made in regnal year 5. I shall make Akhenaten for the Arten my father in this place. It's not far into the proclamation stele that we get to the point where the king says that something was worse than those which I heard in regnal year 4, worse than those which I heard in regnal year 3, and so on and so on and so on. And this has been held up as meaning that it was the priests of Amun and Thebes, and that's why he had to leave, because whatever was going on. And most of the time I think it's ignored, the fact that actually the paragraph begins, as for the something in Akhenaten, it was worse than those which I heard in regnal year 4. So I don't believe this was anything to do with the priests at all. In fact, I don't believe that he had any animosity to do with the priests. The priests owed their existence to the king, and he was king. He was absolute king. So if they had any complaints, then there's not a lot they could do about it. They would have just shut up and got on with it. And I think that all Akhenaten did was, instead of abusing the priests, was that he just ignored them. And I think he just used their resources, their resources and their money to fund his own temples. I don't think he really cared about them. I think he left Thebes to establish new territory. If we look at all the various towns and cities and nomes throughout Egypt, they all had their own cult god, and like Thebes had Amun and the Theban triad. Memphis was the cult god was Ptah, and Akhmin, the cult god was Min. And I think what Akhenaten was looking for was virgin territory, and he even says in the proclamation that the place owes no allegiance to any man or any god. I think he was trying to find virgin territory where he could build this unadulterated new city. This is Stela U, and just along from Stela U, there's a gap in the cliffs over which the sun rises each morning. And it's understood and assumed by many that this is the reason that Akhenaten chose this place, and it's the reason why he named the place Akhenaten, the horizon of the Arten. And here we see the glyph for horizon, which is the 2 mountains with the sun arising in between. And this is kind of what we see happening on a daily basis at Akhenaten. Just up, if we go up that gap in the cliffs, that's the entrance to the Royal Wadi, as it's known, and just a little bit of a drive up the Royal Wadi, and we'll get to the tomb of Akhenaten, originally intended for himself, his daughter Meritaten, and his queen Nefertiti. Unfortunately, looting and just bad quality rock and the deliberate damage done after Akhenaten's reign doesn't leave much to look at. But the mourning of the death of the Princess Meketaten is particularly moving, and really is a fine example of the realism achieved in Amarna art. So, much has been written about Akhenaten and sun worship, but Akhenaten's religion wasn't that really. It was an understanding of a universal creator deity, which to him was best represented by the rays of the sun, the intangible essence of sunlight, giving and maintaining life in the world. With Akhenaten and his queen, it's only high priests. And an interesting theory that I came across recently, the arc of Akhenaten is usually translated as being effective for the Aten. But what we see here, and this is from an inscription from Karnak, we see in the name Horakti rejoices in the horizon is name of, and we see here arc from the Aten as opposed to the name of Shu, and Shu was sunlight. But here we see arc, and arc here is representative of sunlight. So and Akhenaten is very often referred to as the light of every land, light clothed with love like the Aten, the light of every eye, the light of all men, and so on. And Akhenaten's association, his continued association with the god Shu, adds to this, that he was not being effective for the Aten, but he was the sunlight of the Aten. And in the pyramid texts, it's the Akhet, where the king and the sun god become Ark, where Horus is born from Osiris. If we go back to the map of Akhenaten, of Amarna, we see to the right-hand side, this is where the royal wadi is and where the sun rises each morning. And it's my understanding that Akhenaten and the whole Aten concept got rid of the Osirian underworld, and instead of being buried in the west, his tomb is buried in the east. So that what happens is, instead of at the end of the day or at the end of his life, instead of him waging the battling his way through the underworld, through the Duat for the 12 hours of night, what we find is that he's already there, waiting in the morning in the Akhet, waiting to be reborn each day as the Akhenaten. And Flinders Petrie, in his work Telamana, was to note, this distinction of the thought of rays as emitted and apart from the source is very peculiar. In no sun worship have the rays been so clearly appreciated as the source of life and action, and the distinction thus made shows a keener realizing of the scientific distinction between source and rays, and of the real importance of the rays to men, than has ever been touched until perhaps the present century. So, moving on, what else did he do? Well, Akhenaten was a dreamer and a poet and cared nothing for the empire, and so let it all slide, did he? It was in 1887 that a villager digging for fertilizer in Amarna, in Akhenaten, came across a cache of clay tablets, and thinking them completely valueless, she sold them to a neighbour for a few piastres. But the neighbour was made of sharper stuff, and she recognised the importance of these, and she sold them onto the antiquities market. These were the Amarna letters, one of the great finds of archaeology. And basically, it's a series of correspondence between the Egyptian crown and various vassal states and neighbouring states to the lands to the east and the north. The correspondence begins in the final decade of Amenhotep III and ends in the early years of Tutankhamun, spanning the entire reign of Akhenaten. And what we find is an amazing trove of letters talking about politics in play at the time, letters relating to diplomatic marriages, discussions about trade, as well as pleas for help from Pharaoh in dealing with troublesome warlords. Now, these particular pleas for help, again, these are what are held up all the time as Akhenaten just not bothering and just letting it all slide, not caring about any of it. However, if we actually really do read the letters instead of cherry picking, we go and read them, we'll see that actually there were lots of pleas for help were coming in under the reign of Amenhotep III as well. And also a lot of them were just from one person. Further reading shows that many of the letters were reports back to the crown There were pledges of loyalty, assurances that orders had been carried out, and statements that cities were safe and guarded. And here we see Akhenaten adopted the same policy as his father, which was more of a diplomatic policy rather than a kind of warrior policy, of allowing the vassal states and the neighbouring countries, neighbouring kings, to sort out their own nonsense rather than as the crown constantly stepping in. So there were various garrisons and troops out there in the field who would be called upon if things really got out of hand. But for most of the time, people were allowed to just sort out their own issues. The other thing that really needs to be emphasised is that for the most part, what remains of the letters is only one half of a dialogue. So the incoming messages are plentiful, but the outgoing ones, to say the least, the outgoing ones from the palace are pretty thin on the ground. Prepare for the archers of the king much food, wine, and everything plentifully. Behold, he will find thee very quickly, and he will behead the enemies of the king. Know the king is strong, and his troops and chariots are many, and in good condition. And we see here there's a fairly strong suggestion that things will be sorted out. Letters from Akhenaten to various subjects that show his complete grasp of what was going on, and his demand for answers from unruly vassals were actually quite strongly worded. Why hast thou made an agreement with a man with whom the king has disagreed? So thou art not with the king thy lord? If thou renderest submission to the king thy lord, what is there then that the king would not do for thee? If thou do evil, then wilt thou die by the axe of the king. Strong stuff indeed. Year 12, the tomb of Merah II. And we see here a great gathering of people. This is the famous Durbar scene as it's known. For a long time it was suggested that this was perhaps just an annual celebration of tribute, but I think that a little more thought needs to go into it. What we see in the middle, we see Akhenaten and Nefertiti and their 6 daughters behind them. To the left, we see the people from the east, and if you look closely, you can see there are chariots, brought a chariot, there are weapons, there are slaves, and they arrived even with a lion. And on the right are the people from the south, so that's from Kush, from Nubia. And they also bring weapons and gold and tame leopards. And what is important about this scene is that it gives the lie to the whole concept of the empire being lost. What else did he do? He closed the temples and he persecuted the priests. Well, year 12 is where I believe we see the prescription of other gods come into force. And this is most clearly demonstrated in the name change. The living one, sun, ruler of the horizon, who rejoices in the horizon in his name, which is sunlight, which comes from Aten. And so we've lost the mentions of the other gods completely. And the first attested date of the new name, and this really, again, needs to be emphasised, comes from the same tomb of Merah II at Amarna as month 2, year 12. So not as year 9, as is so often suggested and so often put forward. So what we see is the erasure of the name Amun, and sometimes the reference to gods plural. And it's my new understanding, and a lot of more research needs to go into this. My understanding is that there was a long co-regency between Akhenaten and his father died in year 12 of his reign. The Durbar scene that we just saw previously was really the celebration of his rise to being the sole ruler, and I think that what happened is that I think that he was incredibly dependent on his father, in terms of just as a father and son, and also as a co-regent. And I think that he couldn't accept his father's death. His father's name was Amun Hotep. Amun is satisfied. Well, obviously Amun wasn't satisfied because Amun had just taken his father away. And I believe that what we really see here is a direct response from the king in an attack on Amun. And we must remember that in ancient Egypt, the importance of the Ren, of someone's name. If one's name existed, then one's spirit and one's power still existed with it. And the Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians, were a bit like Winston Smith in Orwell's 1984. They just rewrote history as they wanted everyone else to see it. And if that meant erasing somebody's name to restore that kind of balance, that restore mart, then they would go ahead and do this. And I think what we see here after year 12 is one person, the king's complete attack on Amun. And archaeology has shown that many of the other gods weren't prescribed at all, and even people living in Amarna still had their own household gods. And again, as I said earlier, the whole persecution of the priest thing is a construct that comes from the mind of Victorian archaeologists. There is no evidence, but no evidence at all for any of that. Whereas the opposite seems to be the case after the Amarna period, and even then, many years after Akhenaten's disappearance from the scene. But his name was hacked out, his imagery was hacked out, and really quite extensively. His buildings were torn down, destroyed, and more bizarrely than anything else was that he was just denied. He was denied an existence, and again, it's that removal of the Ren, the removal of the name, means that it wasn't there. And if we look at this section of king list, and we start from the right, and we see Amenhotep II, and then we see Thutmose IV, and we see Amenhotep III, and then we would expect to see Akhenaten, but we don't. What we see is Horemheb, and to the left of him will no doubt be Ramesses I. And what is alarming is this gap, because between Amenhotep III and Horemheb, there should be Akhenaten, Semenkhare, Neferuaten, Tutankhamun, and I. 5 kings, just all gone, denied completely. And the reason for this, and this is, I believe, the whole fundamental thing of getting rid of Akhenaten was not about getting rid of the art and religion at all. It stems from Horemheb. Horemheb and his successor, Ramesses I, neither of whom had any real claim to the throne. Horemheb was a commoner, and even I had royal connections, especially if the suggestion that he was T's brother gives him some connection with royal blood. And we remember the rest of them all go back to the beginning of the 18th dynasty, but Horemheb had nothing. And so the important thing for him to do was to just deny everything that happened before. He claimed that he was directly descended from Amenhotep III, and gave himself credibility. And we've seen this happen before with kings. And I believe this is the same story that happened with the defacement of Hatshepsut's stuff. It was not about her being a woman or anything else, and not about her stepson Thutmose III being angry with her because she denied him the throne. It was about Amenhotep II needing to establish his own absolute right to the throne and making sure that there was no counterclaims from anyone else at all. So I had one more trip to make, and that was back north to Cairo to check out, just to go and re-look at those enormous statues in the Amarna rooms at the Egyptian Museum. And it was on leaving that I kind of actually did a double take as I walked past this, because I thought, I really do recognise that iconography, and there, standing outside the Cairo Museum, was the reconstructed sarcophagus of Akhenaten, and a great shame that it's just left outside and not labelled, or anything, and more to my horror to discover that it was that inside people would just use it as a place to chuck their empty plastic water bottles and cigarette ends. Yeah. So what have we learnt? Well, we've learnt that Akhenaten was much more of a king than he's been portrayed over the last 100 years or so. We've seen how his foreign policy was the same as his father's approach to the dominions, as opposed to the picture of him as an idle dreamer who cared nothing for his empire. Akhenaten's so-called heresy was not a one-off thing, but was the culmination of a movement that had begun many years before him, starting with Amenhotep II. Akhenaten left Thebes not because of a hatred of the Amun priesthood, but to find virgin territory for his god. The Amarna style was a reflection of antiquity, or it was a sense of living in the moment rather than a medical report. And finally, the Aten religion was never sun worship, yet that's how it's portrayed the world over. Rather, it was an understanding of a divine universal energy, force, God, call it what you will, that was best depicted through rays of sunlight, an understanding that would not be out of place in today's world. So, where from here? Well, we need to look at the co-regency story. I think there's a lot to be said for the long co-regency. I think an awful lot of things will suddenly be put into place. A lot of the objections, again, are objections that were raised in a different time with a different thought process, and we really do need to reevaluate so much of ancient Egyptian history, not just the Amarna period, but all of it. We need to relook at so much of the stuff. We need to look at Akhenaten and the priests of Amun and that whole story, because there is no evidence for this whole thing. There really isn't. It's a complete fabrication. We need to look at the Amarna succession as to who succeeded, who came after Akhenaten, who was there with him at the end. Was it Nefertiti? Was she Neferuaten? Who was Semenkare? Where did Tutankhamun come from? Whose child was he? There's a lot. There's a very grey area that needs to be looked at. And then talking of the succession, we need to look at Tutankhamun, and we need to look at the volume of Aten-related stuff that there is within his burial goods from KV62, because as far as I'm concerned, by the time Tutankhamun was buried, we're 13-14 years or so after Akhenaten. Now, if there was a complete return to Amun, as is put forward in the questionable restoration stela, then none of this stuff would be allowed to be buried with him, not at all. And I don't just mean the throne, which is alarming that it still has his Tutankhaten name, and you'd think he's the king and anybody can fix that for him. If we really have, welcomed back the reign of Amun, if it ever went away, I think this is the big issue. If it ever went away, I think it was just ignored, and I think we see Akhenaten's stuff because he was the king, and so he was out there able to cut new depictions, build new temples, whatever, and there was nobody else doing it, so he did it. So we see this hiatus from Amenhotep III to Tutankhamun and afterwards. But more importantly, in the tomb of Tutankhaten is the skull cap. Okay, and the because I can accept other stuff being chucked in there and not being fixed, but the skull cap was an important thing that was placed on the dead king's head, right next to his skin, and the fact that it still has Aten iconography, the name of the Aten, on the skull cap, says to me that there's something more going on. This wasn't just a quick rehash and chuck him in a tomb. And then, more importantly, I suppose what I need to do next is to return to the two lands. So, thank you.